welcome Wesley Croft, our productivity coach, going over on how to write an offer. Save your questions to the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to try to go as slow as possible through this. I do realize that sometimes I talk fast. That is a feature and not a bug. But please write down any questions that you might have. You can put them in the chat. I don't even have the chat on right now. I'm not reading it. I'm just going to go through this because this is going to go into the launch program as an updated walkthrough of the purchase agreement. So I'm not going to look at the chat or anything like that, but if you want to make sure that you remember your question, just throw it in the chat and then we'll talk about it when we're done. There's one part I'll just tell you real quick up front. There's a tiny bit of math that you need to be able to do when you write a purchase agreement. Again, I'm going to go through it quickly. I'm only going to do it once. If you need me to go back through it again, I can, but I'm going to try to make it as clear as I can. Okay, so first things first, you guys all learned this in real estate school. Every buyer and seller must have a consumer guide to agency relationships signed and filled out. I put this as the first document to reiterate that point. I'm not going to go over it because you guys should know at this point in time what that is. So we're just going to skip through that and actually get to the really good stuff. If you do have any questions about the consumer guide, just let me know after, but yeah, it should be pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so offer to purchase real estate and acceptance. So we'll just go through this line by line. I'll explain it as we go, and we'll take some questions at the end. So line number one, buyer, the undersigned. This is where your buyer's name goes. So your buyer offers to buy the following property at line two. This is where the property address goes. Line three, permanent parcel number. So you'll get this permanent parcel number from the auditor's website. This is the legal description of the property that they have at the courthouse to tell them which property is which. So that permanent parcel number is very important that it goes on there so the title company makes sure that the property that you're purchasing is actually the property that you're purchasing. First big paragraph, so lines 4 through 11. Buyers will get panicky about this, but don't let them. So the way that you explain this is this. The buyer, which property accepts in its as-is present physical condition. Now, buyers will say, time out, stop. I'm not buying this house as is. That was not part of the deal. And you'll just look at them and say, you're right. It was not part of the deal. We are going to build contingencies into the offer as we move through it. So don't panic. But this is just setting the stage for we're accepting the property like it sits. And oh, by the way, there are some things that must fall into place in order for us to continue with the purchase, which we'll get to in a moment. But don't freak out and don't let them freak out when you read that. Okay. So the buyer accepts it in its as-is present physical condition, including the land, appurtenant rights, privileges, easements, buildings, fixtures, so on and so forth. Then starting on line 6, it's saying everything that must stay in the property. So a lot of what you see on line 6 and 7 and 8 are all just normal things that you would have learned in real estate school. So, for example, all of the electrical, heating, plumbing, and bathroom fixtures, all the windows, the door shades, blinds, awnings, screens, storm windows, curtain and drapery fixtures, landscaping stuff, garbage disposal, smoke detectors, garage door openers, and then on line 7, where that blank is, I typically just write the word all. So I want all of the garage door openers. And then all permanently attached carpeting. Now, starting on line 8 through 11 is where you can start to check boxes based on what the seller said in the MLS that they were going to leave at the property. You know, most of the time, 98% of the time, it's, you know, the stove, the microwave, the fridge, the dishwasher, you know, 50-50 on whether they're leaving the washer and the dryer, you know, things like that. Make sure that you are very clear with the expectation that you set with the buyer on what all is staying. If there is anything that is unclear, please, please, please reach out to the listing agent and say, hey, I've got a question about this. What's going on here? I will tell you from personal experience, one of the biggest issues that I see is this issue around the curtains, the curtain rods, the blinds, like those sorts of things, all that is very clearly spelled out in the contract. I would say, just from another personal experience, if there are gas logs, make sure when you look at a fireplace, if there's gas logs in there, that's not technically a fixture. So they could take them, and I had a buyer who the seller took the gas logs. I didn't check the box for gas logs. Guess who's having to buy gas logs at closing? This guy. So just make sure that you look at these things so that you understand, hey, these are things that could or could not stay, and make sure you check the box so that the buyer is not surprised and you are not surprised at the end that something left that should have stayed. Okay, so line 12 also included. Please know that line 12 is not for things like chattel. So for example, you can't put also included the bedroom suite in the bedroom, in the master bedroom, the couch in the basement, right? Those things need a separate bill of sale on a separate agreement that is not on line 12 here. So please don't use line 12 for that. Line 12 would be for things like a hot tub is a big one. Things that are not included, anything that they say in the broker remarks that's not included. Sometimes people will say, hey, the chandelier in the dining room is not included, right? Just make sure that you write that on there so that everyone is clear and there's no misunderstandings when you get to the closing table. I've seen it 100 times, and there's other agents on this call that have seen it 100 times, where you don't spell it out on lines 12 through 15, what's included and not included. And at the end of the transaction, everything goes haywire because the expectation was not set up front. So be very, very clear with those things. Here, lines 16 and 17 even outlines this even more. The parties understand and agree that the foregoing terms related to fixtures and chattel/personal items supersede any listing and marketing information included in the MLS. So anything that you write on there is going to supersede what they put in the MLS. So just make sure all those things match up. All right, second, this next paragraph, 18 through 22, secondary offer. At this point in time, you'll have to check the box whether or not this is a secondary offer. Now, what is a secondary offer? 99.9% of the time, you are not going to be writing a secondary offer. What this means is that if your original offer was in a multiple offer situation, and you lost, let's say, for example, and you get a call from the listing agent that says, oh, I'm so sorry. Nice try, but you guys came in second place. And then they might say to you, hey, would you like to be a secondary offer? All that means is that you go back into your offer, you check the box that says this is a secondary offer. And what that does is that puts you in next position. It gives you sort of a right of first refusal. If that first deal falls out of contract, you're next in line to be able to snag the house for your buyer. So that's what that's for. Line 23, price. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Here's my offer price. Here's what we're offering. Earnest money. So this is the little bit of math that I told you that we were going to do here. This is where this is going to come into play. So earnest money, as most of you should know, is a good faith deposit that the buyer is putting up front right when you go into contract, that then counts toward their down payment at the end once everyone settles at the end of the transaction. So if we do a little bit of easy math, let's say the purchase price is $100,000. Earnest money is typically 1% of the purchase price. So at $100,000, you're going to pay $1,000 in earnest money. Let's say that this is a really well-qualified buyer. They're going to do a conventional loan at 20% down. 20% of 100,000 is 20,000. So on line 23, under price, you're going to put 100,000. On line 28, where it asks you how much earnest money you're going to put down, you're going to put 1,000. On line 29, it says cash down payment to be deposited with escrow agent. You are not going to put 20,000. Even though that's the amount they're putting down, you're actually going to put 19,000. The reason why is they've already put down $1,000 worth of earnest money up front. So $1,000 plus 19,000 equals their $20,000 down payment. We can go over that math again in a little bit, but I just wanted to at least introduce it to you now. So what you do is you then go to line 30. So the mortgage loan to be obtained by the buyer. So in our example, you've got a $100,000 purchase price You have 20% that you're putting down, so you're left with 80%. So 80% of 100,000 is 80,000. That is how much their mortgage loan is going to be. It's going to be for 80,000. So that's how you do that. That's how you do that math. Line 31 tells the listing agent what sort of financing your buyer is getting. So are they doing a conventional loan, FHA, VA? Are they paying cash? And then other would be like hard money lending and stuff like that, which we won't go over today. Line 32. We used to, on our old contract, we used to have to write this into the also included line or either put it on a different addendum. But this is where you would write if you wanted the seller to pay any of your buyer closing costs. So you just put seller shall contribute. There's a blank line there. If you want it to be very, very clear to everyone in both the buyer and the seller, write a number there, not a percentage. So if it's 100,000 and you want them to pay 3% of your closing costs for your buyer, put $3,000 there. It just makes it easier and more tidy for everyone, because then they're not contributing, $2,372.47 because you just wrote in 2.5% or some crazy number. It'd be easier for the title company and everyone. Okay, so this next block, lines 34 to 44. This is where we start to build in. You remember what I said earlier about hey, you're going to accept this as is. Now we're going to start to build in some contingencies within the offer. This is the first one. So we call this the financing contingency. So we'll read starting on line 34. It says this offer is conditioned upon buyer making written application for the above mortgage loan within X number of days after acceptance. Okay, so let me help you understand what this is. When you go get a pre-approval, so when a buyer goes out to Huntington or Chase or Union Home Mortgage, Cross Country, wherever, when they get a pre-approval, they are not making formal application for a loan at that point. They are just getting a pre-approval. Once you go into contract, your buyer must go make written application within a certain amount of days, whatever days you put there. I put 7 days there. So you're giving the buyer 7 days to actually call the lender and say, hey, I'm in contract. I need to make formal application on this loan. So then let's say today's the 27th of October. On the 27th of October, if we went into contract today, the clock would start to tick today. And we're talking about calendar days, not business days. So by next Monday, or actually by next Sunday night, they need to have made written application for the loan with the lender if you write 7 days in that blank on line 34. Now, the rest of the sentence says, and obtaining a written commitment for that loan on or about blank. So that blank can be 30 days, 45 days. Basically, that blank is for what I do is I try to put it 7 to 10 days prior to closing. Now, you're asking yourself, what is written commitment? Written commitment is the lender for the loan saying, hey, we've done the underwriting, we've got them conditionally approved, you're all good to go, we're going to give them the loan, we're just waiting for closing at this point. Okay, so Wesley, what happens if those dates get passed up? Well, the loan commitment date is very important because starting on line 36, it says if, despite buyer's good faith efforts, that commitment is not timely obtained, then this agreement shall be null and void. So if you don't get loan commitment by the day that it states you are going to get it, the contract then becomes null and void. Now, you could call the listing agent and say, hey, they need a couple more days. That's okay. As long as everyone agrees to that, write an addendum up, get it signed, and make sure that everyone understands, hey, we're waiting 2, 3, 4 more days for loan commitment. It's coming, and save yourself a lot of heartache. Now, if you don't get loan commitment, meaning the buyer loses their job, gets hurt, something happens where they can now no longer afford the loan, that's when the contingency takes place that allows them to get their earnest money back. So let's see here. Line 37, upon execution of a mutual release by seller and buyer, the earnest money deposit shall be returned to buyer upon confirmation that the deposit has cleared and without any further liability of the parties or to broker and its agents. So if for some reason the yeah, if for some reason loan commitment's not obtained, the buyer can receive their earnest money back. Obviously, like depending on what the lender says. If the lender says, hey, like they just don't want to buy it, they got cold feet, then that's a different scenario. And we'll go over that. There's a contingency for that later on too. The other thing that I wanted to say about this, so on line 39 to 44, essentially what this says is if there's an argument about the earnest money has to sit at the title company for a period of 2 years. After a period of 2 years, if there have been no other claims made on the earnest money, the buyer can then receive that money back. But it's a 2-year wait for them. Okay, next page. So closing. This is very, very important. When we changed the contract a couple of years ago, the offer to purchase, we actually wrote this in because it was super important, because the wording is very, very used to be a little bit vague. Now it's very clear. Here's what it says. Line 46, all funds and documents necessary to complete this transaction shall be placed in escrow with the lending institution or escrow agent on or before blank date, and closing of escrow and disbursement on or about blank. Closing of escrow and disbursement. Closing happens when the title company emails you at the end of the transaction and says, we are closed and all funds are dispersed. The reason why the next sentence starting on line 48 is in there, there's a very particular reason. It says buyer and seller understand and agree that timing of recording of the deed is at the discretion of the recorder's office in the county in which the property is located. There were several different court cases and all of that revolving around individuals not wanting to give possession to a buyer because they said, well, the deed's not been recorded at the courthouse, therefore we're not giving you possession. When in reality, the escrow had already been closed and the seller had already received their funds. So what's going on here is that you're signing and the seller is signing when they sign and execute the contract. Hey, whatever this day is that's on here for closing and possession. So you'll notice that there's 3 blanks there, one on 47, one on 48, and one on 51. Unless you have negotiated possession post-close. So unless you've negotiated possession post-close, I would put the same date for all 3 of those. So if you're closing on, let's say, December 1st, I would say December 1 on line 47, December 1 on line 48, and December 1 on line 51. Now, if you have negotiated possession post-close, meaning, hey, the buyer's going to give the seller 2 or 3 days because they're moving to a different house, they need 2 or 3 days to move out of the one and into the other, then on line 51, you would put that other date. So in our scenario, December 1st, maybe they need till December 4th. On line 51, you would put December 4th. So just know that once you get an email from the escrow company, so from the title company saying, hey, we're all done, everything's all closed, congratulations, all the funds have been dispersed, you can tell your buyer they can go get the keys. So I want to be very, very clear on that. Okay, so lines 54 to 60. This is walkthrough. So we used to have a completely separate addendum for this. Now it's been absorbed into our contract. But it basically says that the buyer and seller agree that the buyer can do a final walkthrough of the property on or about, and then you put the number there. I put 3 days there. So we want 3 days prior to closing to make sure that everything is as it was when we had the property inspected. Now, if it's not, there's a few things in here. So number 1, line 56. Buyer acknowledges and agrees that they may not raise any issues about the property's condition at the walkthrough if the condition existed when the buyer viewed or inspected it. So at inspection, you see there's something going on. During the whole process of working your way and negotiating your way through the inspection, you just were like, hey, you know what, like we'll let that issue slide. You can't then come back at the final walkthrough and go, oh, you know what, like our bad. We should have mentioned this ahead of time. We knew about it, but just didn't say anything. Can't do that. Now, if the walkthrough, and this is on line 57, if the walkthrough evidences a material adverse change in the property's condition, meaning there's been cabinets ripped out, there's a giant hole in the basement wall, things like that, buyer's got to notify the seller, and then both parties have to agree in writing. Either the seller has money held in escrow so that it can get fixed, or the seller has to credit the buyer, X amount of dollars, whatever they agree on, through the closing. So that's another contingency that's sort of built in. Okay, lines 61 to 73. So this is a big one. And the way that I explain this to my buyers, it's the same way that I'll explain it to you. This gives instructions to the title company for what they need to do. Actually, this is line 61 all the way to 87. So this is so line 67 is saying, hey, who's the title company going to be? We've got great title company partners here with Ohio Real Title. Actually, on line 66, you'll see there's literally a box that's checked that you can check that says, hey, I'm just going to use Ohio Real Title. Or if you've got some sort of relationship with another title company, you can obviously write those folks in on line 67. So on line 61, seller shall convey marketable title to buyer by general warranty and or fiduciary deed with release of dower, free and clear of all liens and encumbrances, except for any mortgage that's being assumed by the buyer, which in my 9 years of being in real estate, that's never happened. B, such restrictions, conditions, or easements and encroachments that do not materially adversely affect the use or value of the property. You would know that based on the title search, which we'll get into in a second. Zoning ordinances or taxes and assessments. So what that means is anything and everything that the seller may owe to anyone from the time that they lived there, they must pay those things to whomever they need to be paid to prior to closing or at closing with their proceeds. If they don't, then we've got an even bigger issue. But it's written in right now. When they sign it, they are signing, they agree, hey, if there's, tax assessment that's there, mechanics lien, anything that's there that could potentially not be able to allow your buyer to receive a clear title must be handled by them. Okay. So we'll scroll down here just a little bit. Line 74 to 87 talks about prorations. Now, I'm not going to get into the math today of tax proration and how that works in Cuyahoga County in particular, since that's the county that most of us live in and do business in. I'm not going to go into all that. If you need help with figuring out tax proration from that standpoint, talk to someone at a title company, come in and speak with me. You can speak with our other productivity coach. We can sort of walk you through how the math works. But essentially, this paragraph is telling the title company, hey, make sure you do all the prorations. You got to prorate rent, HOAs, taxes, anything and everything that gets paid by the seller on a periodic basis must be prorated from the time that the seller lived there so that your buyer doesn't have to pay for anything from when the seller lived there. Okay. Now, these last few lines, line 84, the escrow agent shall withhold blank dollars from the seller to secure payment of final water and sewer charges. So I put $250 in that line. Different people put different things. I put $250, but that should basically what happens with the water is you can't just call the water company a week in advance and say, hey, switch the water over to my name. The water company will not switch it over into your name until it's been recorded at the courthouse. So what this is trying to do is to make sure that if there's an outstanding water bill that needs to be paid by the seller, it gets paid by them with this $250 that gets withheld. Okay, so 88 to line 99. Everybody's always wondering. I have sellers that ask me this and buyers that ask me this all the time. What are closing costs? Like what are those things? And so this spells it out. So starting on line 90, I'll blow through it for the sellers, and then I'll go down to the buyers and I'll explain it further. So line 90, seller shall pay the following cost: real estate transfer tax. And here's that thing that we talked about earlier. Any amount required to discharge any mortgage, lien, or encumbrance not assumed by the buyer. So unless the buyer is like, hey, you know what? I'm going to take on that tax lien, or I'm going to take on that mechanics lien, or whatever. Assuming that the buyer has said, I'm not assuming any of that stuff, the seller has to pay for it all. This spells it out in black and white. The seller must give any amount required to discharge any of that stuff. Okay. C, the title exam and 1/2 the cost of insuring premium for owner's fee policy of title insurance. So half the cost of title insurance. Any proration due to the buyer. So this is that proration that we just talked about. 1/2 of the escrow, and then F for anything other than that. Also on line 94, seller shall directly pay all utility charges to the date of title transfer or the date of possession, whichever is later. That's very important. If you're representing a seller, as a side note, your seller has to pay all the utilities up until title transfer or date of possession. And then the last thing, especially if you deal a lot with investments, tenant security deposits, if any, shall be credited in escrow to the buyer. So if you're purchasing an investment property where a tenant has given a security deposit, the security deposit must go from the seller to the buyer so that the buyer has that security deposit. Okay, so line 96, buyer shall pay the following through escrow. So 1/2 of the escrow fee. The way that I explain this to my client is anything and everything that the title company has to do to help you get this across the finish line, you have to pay for that. They don't work for free. Nobody really balks at that, but that's what that is. They have to pay the other half of the title insurance. C, all recording fees for the deed and any mortgage. These are the recording fees for taking all the paperwork down to the courthouse to getting that recorded down there. And then D, a commission of $249 if the buyer is represented by KWGM. That $249 will come into play later. However, just remember that every time you look at your buyer and you say, hey, me representing you is free, it's not technically free. They've got to pay a $249 fee to the office. But nobody's ever said anything about that to me about, oh, I don't want to pay that, that sort of thing. I'm sure that those horror stories exist. But just so you know, that's there. Limited home warranty. So this is where you would note if the buyer wants to purchase a home warranty. Now, you could put it if they want to buy one from APHW, so America's Preferred Home Warranty is one of our partners. They can do that here. They can also purchase one outside the transaction if they want. It's so much easier if they just do it here. So you would put line 101, will or will not be provided from. That first blank is whatever the company is. So HSA, APHW, whoever you wanted to buy it from or through, and then at a cost of X amount of dollars. So we'll go over this in a second, but there's an APHW document that spells out all the different fees. And so you just go and check boxes and you just add up everything that you checked on the bottom. There's going to be a total. You just put that total there. Now, the cost of the limited home warranty shall be charged to, and then here's where you're going to check the box. It's either going to be the seller or the buyer. Okay. Also, line 102, the parties acknowledge that the limited home warranty requires buyer to pay a deductible in the event of a claim and does not cover pre-existing defects in the property. Closing disclosures. This gives the title company authorization to send a final copy of all the closing disclosures to us at the end of the transaction. And so if you're the buyer's agent, you would check the boxes for selling broker. All right, inspection. So I talked to you guys earlier about different contingencies that you're going to build into the contract. This is another one. So this is the inspection contingency. Starting on line 109, this agreement shall be contingent upon the following inspections by a professional inspector of buyer's choice within the specified number of days from the date of acceptance. So again, we're working on calendar days, not business days. So just make sure that you understand that. This line 116 to 122 is super, super, super important. I tell my buyers this, I actually read this to them. If buyer does not elect inspections, buyer acknowledges that buyer is acting against the advice of buyer's agent and broker. Buyer understands that all real property and improvements may contain defects and conditions that are latent / not readily apparent and which may affect a property's use or value. The parties agree that the brokers and agents do not guarantee and in no way assume responsibility for the property's condition. Buyer acknowledges that it is buyer's own duty to exercise reasonable care to inspect and make diligent inquiry of the seller or buyer's inspectors regarding the condition and systems of the property. So just know the way I explain it to my buyers is I cannot make you do an inspection, but I am highly, highly, highly recommending it. And I think you're absolutely crazy if you don't. And I say this even to my new build construction folks. I can tell you a whole bunch of horror stories about my in-laws who built a home with a well-known builder here that had they not had it inspected, there would have been a world of issues. So even for your new builds, please, please, please help your buyers understand they should get the property inspected. Now, what sort of inspections could they get? There's a bunch of them listed on here. I'll go through them quickly. You have a general home inspection, a septic system inspection. So if you're selling properties that have septic, there's a separate addendum for that, which we will not go over today. But if that happens, please pull one of us in and let us know so that we can help walk you through that. Water potability and well flow rate. So again, if you're way out in the country and this particular property has a well, you want to make sure one, that the water is actually drinkable. That's water potability. And two, the well flow rate. So can you get water out of the well to the degree that you need to be able to use it in your property, like for a water pressure standpoint? We don't mess with either of those three if it's public water and public sewer. Radon. So radon is a odorless, colorless gas that can cause lung cancer. You cannot, that's all you can say to your client. You can't tell them you should absolutely do this or you shouldn't absolutely, like, just don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. Do not ever let anyone tell you that radon is really only present out in the country in basements. The highest radon level I have ever seen was a client that I was the listing agent. This was a slab ranch in Westlake, the highest I've ever seen. It took 3 radon mitigation systems to clear the radon out. So don't let anyone tell you that, like, hey, if you're in the city, you don't have to worry about radon. It's not true. Mold. So if you want to have the property inspected for mold, if you maybe see some evidence of somewhere, have a musty smell, if your buyer wants to have that done, you can certainly have that done. Pest or wood destroying insects. So this would be termites. Lead-based paint, if you want to have the home inspected for lead-based paint. And then other. So generally, the way that it works for me is what I tell my clients, hey, have the general home inspection. The general home inspector should look for evidences of mold and of termites and those sorts of things. Obviously, they cannot look inside walls. That's beyond the scope of what they do. And so what I do is I check the box for general and I put 7 days. So we want 7 days to have a general home inspection. And then on line 133 for other, I put 10 days. And then on line 134, if you're doing this in dot loop, if you start typing, it will pre-fill it for you. But basically what it will say is any other inspections deemed necessary by the general home inspector. So that gives you an extra few days. Let's say the home inspector goes in and he's like, yeah, everything looks great, except for you need to have someone come and look at the electrical panel because there's some weird wiring in there or whatever. That gives you time to then get a electrician out. If you need to get a plumber out, those sorts of things. It gives you a couple of extra days to get more inspectors out to really dig into whatever the general home inspector found. If you find that you're bumping up against your time limit here, just reach out to the listing agent and have a conversation. It's better to just talk those things out than to like try to be slick and like go past the date for a couple of days, like just have a conversation. Most people will work with you because they want to get the house sold as much as you want your buyer to get it. Lines 135 to 142. So this is about termites. So if selected above, so if you had selected this above, an inspection of all structures shall be made by a licensed inspection or exterminating agency, and the written report will be given to the buyer. If the report shows existing infestation or damage, treatment of the condition shall be made by a licensed agency, and then they have to furnish a certificate of guarantee for a period of at least 1 year in the case of termites and 60 days in the case of wood destroying insects, so carpenter ants and the like. All repair and treatment costs shall be paid by, and then check the box. So either the buyer or the seller, unless VHA or FHA regulations prohibit payment by the buyer. This agreement may be voided by the party paying for the repair and treatment if the cost exceeds $500. So if there's a big issue, the agreement can be null and void. All right, lead-based paint. If I've been doing this for a long time. I've talked to people that have done this for a long time. People that want lead-based paint tests are very, very, very few and far between. But if they do, this outlines what needs to happen in that case. Now, please remember that if the house was built before 1978, you're going to have a lead-based paint disclosure, and you're going to have to share the EPA pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, with the buyer. That's just law, right? We have to do that. So if they want to have a risk assessment or inspection, they can do that. They're more than happy to do it. And the rest of that paragraph outlines what happens if they find lead-based paint in the home. So line 146, if they're found by the inspector, buyer has the right to terminate, or they can request that the seller repair specific existing deficiencies noted in the report. So if they do that, the buyer is going to have to provide the seller with a written inspection. Then the seller is going to have the option either to agree or not to agree. If the seller says, yeah, we'll do it, then they've got to provide a certificate from another inspector once it's been done. So, typical normal stuff that you think would have to happen. So that's that. Line 155. So waiver. Here's a really important thing. Buyer elects to waive each professional inspection to which they have not indicated yes. Buyer acknowledges and agrees that any failure by them to perform an inspection elected above is a waiver of such inspection and shall be deemed absolute acceptance of the property by the buyer in its as-is condition. So what this means is, one, when they initial that box, they're saying, okay, like if they didn't check the box for well flow rate, water potability, and septic, that they're like, okay, we're taking that just like it sits. But if they check the box for general inspection 7 days and then they're just never have one done, then once that date is passed, they have officially waived their right to have that, and they can no longer do it. Line 158 to 176. This explains what happens once all the inspections are done. So within 3 days after completion of the last inspection, the buyer is going to have to do one of the following. So one of three things. One, they can say, hey, everything went great with the inspection. There's a couple of minor things, but we'll take care of those. Not a big deal. We'll move forward. That's the first. Second, they will accept the property subject to the seller agreeing to have certain things repaired. So let's say a few things came up and you're like, hey, the buyer still loves the property. They want the property, but there were a few things that they feel like the seller should really repair. The buyer and seller agree. Seller agrees to repair it. You write that on your removal of contingency form and you move on. The third option is the inspection went so horrible that the buyer now no longer wants to buy the property. They can send over a mutual release and say, hey, there were some things that came up on the inspection that weren't disclosed. We don't want to deal with those issues. We want to be done with the transaction. that's completely normal. So one of those three options. So the rest of that, so 163 to 176 just gives outline on how those things need to work. So if it's accepted as it in its as is present physical condition, the buyer has to sign a removal of contingency. If the property is subject to seller repairing things, the buyer's got to provide the seller a copy of the pages where those defects came up on the inspection report. And so then buyer and seller have 3 days from the seller getting it, from the seller receiving those documents to actually come to an agreement. If a written agreement is not signed by both parties within that 3 days, then the agreement shall be null and void. Everyone signs a mutual release. The buyer gets the earnest money back. The thing is, people will ask me, well, like we're still negotiating, we're past the 3 days, like, is that okay? Please just stay in communication with the listing agent, right? Like it doesn't need to go on for 2 weeks. It can't. But if you're over by a day, 2 days, seller's trying to get quotes for the buyer, seller's trying to get quotes to figure out how much this is going to cost, like everyone can play nicely in the sandbox. And if you have any crazy questions about dates and, hey, we're this far past this one or this far past this one, Andrew Ginter is a great person to call and ask about that. Okay. Line 177 to 183. This is the buyer saying, hey, I have received a copy of the lead-based paint disclosure and the EPA pamphlet, or I have not. So when you go onto the MLS, hopefully when you go to write an offer, the listing agent has put both the property disclosure and the lead-based paint disclosure on the MLS as an attachment that you can download. So if they have line 177, you check the box, the buyer initials, hey, I got those things, we're good. If they have not, line 179, check the box, has not, have them initial it. And then line 182 says, hey, this offer is subject to us receiving the lead-based paint disclosure and us agreeing to what's on it. And then on line 183, you would put within X days of receipt, I would put 3 in that box, the number 3. Line 184, Megan's Law. What this states is that it is the buyer's sole responsibility to determine whether or not they are moving in next door to a sex offender. You cannot do that due diligence for them. The buyer must do it themselves. Line 188, this is the same exact thing as we just went over with the lead-based paint, except it's for the residential property disclosure. So either they have received it or they have not received it, and you would check the boxes on 192 or 194, depending on whether or not they have received it. Okay. Line 197 to 202 is very, very important. Seller shall pay all costs for repair of any water or gas line leak found between the street and the foundation at the time of transfer or restoration of utilities. Not a lot of people know this, but from where your utilities tie in at the street to your property, that is your responsibility. So if something breaks, if the water line breaks in the middle of your front yard, the gas line has a leak in the middle of your front yard, you are on the hook to pay for that as the owner of the property. What this is saying is, for example, if utility transfer happens on the day of closing and it's determined that there's a leak, the seller is on the hook to repair it. Representations and disclaimers. So 203 to 216. Essentially what this states is that it is the buyer's responsibility to do the due diligence to make sure that the property that they're buying is the same square footage as what it was advertised as, same zoning, lot dimensions, anything and everything that would be a, what's the word I'm looking for? Anything and everything about the house that they deem to be true. It is the buyer's responsibility to ensure that it is by getting the proper inspections done and doing anything and everything that they can to make sure that everything that the seller said or the listing agent said from a representation and disclaimer perspective is true. They cannot come back and sue the listing agent, the seller, the buyer's agent, like, because they didn't do enough due diligence. So make sure that they understand that all of that is completely and totally 100% on them to do it. Okay. 217 to 220, so damage. This is another contingency that's built in. So let's say we go through and do the final walkthrough. If we find that the property has been destroyed, so let's say the negotiation went really terrible and the buyer and the seller don't like each other for whatever reason. When you do the final walkthrough, you want to make sure that the seller didn't get really mad and flood the basement or tear the cabinets out or do something crazy like that. What it says on line 217, if improvements to the property are destroyed or damaged in excess of 10% of the purchase price before closing and disbursement, the buyer can accept the insurance proceeds from the seller for said damage and complete the transaction, or they can terminate the agreement and receive all of the earnest money back. If such damage is less than 10% of the purchase price, the seller shall restore the property to its prior condition. Okay, line 221, electronic data security. The way that I explain this is I say, listen, Mr. Buyer, I am never going to ask you for your bank account information because I don't need to know that. As agents, I don't need the buyer's bank account information, debit card number, credit card number, anything like that. And so this is saying like, hey, I'm not going to ask you that. Binding agreement. I call this the cold feet clause. So basically what it's saying is, listen, you are signing an agreement that is legally binding. If one or the other party, either the buyer or the seller, chooses not to perform based on what the contract states, the other party can bring legal action. So just help them to understand that, hey, if you get cold feet and you don't want to buy the house, you get buyer's remorse, like, that's okay. No one can make you buy a house. No one can force you to buy a house, but they can keep your earnest money and they can take you to court. That's a real thing that happens every single day. So just make sure they understand that it is a legally binding agreement once everyone signs. 235, so any addendums that are part of the contract. So the agency disclosure, property disclosure, lead-based paint, those are the most common ones. If you have a septic addendum, for example, if you had a septic system, if you had a VHA loan or a VA loan, sorry, a VA loan or an FHA loan, those things would be included. Condo addendums, home sale, contingency, those sorts of things. Just make sure that you're checking all those boxes on there. So then the buyer will sign, then we'll scroll down, the seller will sign, all of the listing agent's information will be on here or should be on here. Make sure all of your information as a selling agent is on here. And then we'll get to this last little part. So notice this says 6 of 6. So that's the official contract. And then there's one other document because everybody wants to get paid. So this is the buyer broker comp agreement. There's one really important thing that I need to mention on here. So all of this is pretty self-explanatory. So lines 3, 4, 5, and 6 are just saying who's the seller, who's the listing brokerage, who's the buyer, who's the buyer's broker. And then on line 7, here's where the address goes. Now, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, and 15. This is some of that math that I'm not going to go over super crazy, but as a buyer's agent, make sure you ask the listing agent, hey, is there compensation being offered? Is that coming from the seller or is that coming from the listing agent? There's a difference there. Either the seller is paying it directly out of their proceeds or the seller is paying the listing agent a huge chunk, and then they're parsing off part of that for you as the buyer's agent. So that's what the difference between number 1 and number 2 on lines 12 and 13. So on line 12, the seller is agreeing to pay you X amount, or line 2, the listing brokerage is agreeing to pay you, X amount. So you'll just have to ask the listing agent that question. Now, line 3, you may be thinking, oh, well, the buyer is agreeing to pay nothing because the buyer's not paying me, the seller or the listing agent is. You would be wrong. Remember that $249 fee that we talked about under the buyer's closing costs up a few minutes ago. That 249 must go on line 3. If the 249 is not included, guess who's paying the 249? You are. So you would take lines 1, 2, and 3, you would add them all together, and that's what goes on line 15. So then everybody signs at the bottom. So buyer, seller, listing agent, buyer's agent. Okay. So that's it. So that's the purchase agreement. Now, I also added a couple of other things that you're going to need when you write an offer to make sure that the offer package is complete. So the first thing is the agency disclosure statement. So this document is outlining who represents who in the transaction. So at the top, property address, obvious, buyer, seller, and then there are three different things that you can check here. Most of the time, it's going to be a transaction involving two agents in different brokerages. So it's just explaining, okay, the buyer is going to be represented by me and KWGM. The seller is going to be represented by, so-and-so at Howard Hanna, whatever. The second one, so involving two agents in the same brokerage. So for example, if I was doing a deal with Chris Burns, our team leader, I would check this box. So if two agents in the real estate brokerage, KWGM, we would check the top box. Agent Wesley works for the buyer and agent Chris works for the seller. Okay. There's also some dual agency on here. So that'd be section 3. If you're doing dual agency, if you feel like you want to do a dual agency deal, please talk to Andrew Ginter before you do it. That is very, very important. I have done a deal where I checked this second box. So under section 3, the second box where it says represent only the blank. For example, if you are representing a buyer who wants to purchase a for sale by owner. So you would check this box and say, I'm representing only the buyer in this transaction. The other party, meaning the FSBO, is not represented and agrees to represent themselves. So that's when you would check that box. So then everybody signs at the bottom. And then page 2, there's some more talk about dual agency, which we won't get into today. I just put a copy of the property disclosure form on here just so you could see that it's a part of the package. So again, download that from the actual listing itself on the MLS. And then make sure that your buyer reads over it. They initial every page and sign on the last page. So we'll scroll through this. Then I've got a lead-based paint form. The seller will have signed or initialed right here where it's got seller's disclosure, and then purchaser's acknowledgement is where your buyer will initial. And agent's acknowledgement, you are the purchaser's agent. You will have to initial there, and then everyone will have to sign on the bottom of the second page. I also put the EPA pamphlet in here, which we'll scroll through very quickly. I just wanted it in there so you could see it, and it would remind you to make sure that you give it to your buyer. And then at the very end, I've got, so I talked to you about the America's Preferred Home Warranty invoice. And over on the right-hand side would be all the plan options. So this will tell you exactly how much everything costs. Okay. And then at the bottom, so you'll just add everything up. And once you get to the bottom, there's a total, just so that everybody's aware of how much it's going to cost. Now, whether or not your buyer is getting a home warranty, this must be signed by your client. So if your client's like, hey, I don't want the home warranty, I'm not going to pay for it, or you find out that the seller is not offering one, that's cool. Your client must still sign this particular form at the bottom where it says waiver. Also, so that's A. Let's talk about B, which is this affiliated business arrangement disclosure. Essentially, what those two documents are is they are disclosing that KWGM has a third-party business affiliation with a third-party vendor. So for Ohio Real Title and for America's Preferred Home Warranty, your client must understand that Keller Williams Greater Metropolitan could derive a financial benefit from either one of those organizations, can and does. So from Ohio Real Title or for America's Preferred Home Warranty.